6 years ago, not long after I started this channel, one of the very first horror games I reviewed was 2004's The Suffering. I had planned to go over its sequel, The Ties That Bind, shortly thereafter, but, I got distracted. I had 2 kids. COVID hit. A lot's happened. Anywho, I thought this would not only be a grand time to finally delve into The Ties That Bind, but also revisit The Suffering and package them both together. The original video is fine, but I was just starting out with this YouTube thing, and I was also trying to use a spooky voice when covering horror games that is, well, frankly a bit cringe now. So with better equipment, more experience under my belt, and maybe a couple of more subscribers, let's check out both games in Midway's The Suffering franchise. But before we begin, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video to help this channel grow. Also, check the links in the description below to become an honored supporter where you can get early access to all of my content. The Suffering has players taking on the role of Torque, an inmate on death row for the vicious murder of his wife and 2 children. Torque is housed at the infamous Abbott State Penitentiary, situated offshore of Baltimore, Maryland, on the bloody Carnate Island, an isolated place with a history even more violent than that of the prisoners it confines. One night, a tremendous earthquake rocks the prison, awakening something evil that has lay slumbering in the island's depths for millennia. The power goes out, and just when the inmates think that they have a chance at freedom, vile creatures from the underworld rise to hunt them down like wild game. Torque, along with his fellow inmates and the guards that have caused them so much grief, must band together and fight for survival, or else become just another victim to the terrors of the wicked island. The Suffering was published by Midway Games, a legendary company that had made its name manufacturing amusement games beginning in 1958. Their first major video game hit was publishing Taito's Space Invaders in the West, but they would later create such classics as Miss Pac-Man, Spy Hunter, Gauntlet, Rampage, NBA Jam, and of course, Mortal Kombat. By the mid-2000s, Midway was in financial decline and hadn't had a bestseller in years. They shifted their attention towards single-player console games with titles such as Haven, Call of the King, Dr. Mudo, and Psyops. Among these were also the Suffering games. Midway had hoped to find success with the survival horror genre and had big plans to spin it into a major franchise. They even had a movie planned. On a positive note, The Suffering did make an impact when it first arrived in 2004. Alas, Midway was never able to dig itself out of its hole, and it began closing studios beginning in 2005 and went completely defunct by 2010. The Suffering's aim was to present a game with action as heavy as Devil May Cry, while maintaining the atmosphere and scares of Resident Evil. The environment of Abbott State Penitentiary is unnerving, filled with pitch-dark hallways, rooms of rotting corpses, and copious amounts of blood painting nearly every surface. The developers make excellent use of the prison grounds for a horror title, too, nailing the isolated claustrophobic feeling many prisoners live with every day, while using larger areas like the cafeteria and open showers to stage vicious battles against hordes of baddies. Speaking of, the Suffering's enemies are perhaps the real stars of the show. These nightmarish fiends mix the best elements of Silent Hill and the Hellraiser franchises to give us some creatures that truly chill you to your core. These are monsters born out of pure misery, appearing tortured with extreme disfigurements, heavy spikes impaled into their flesh, barbed wire wrapped around their mangled carcasses, and even their limbs torn off and replaced with cruel weaponry. Many of the beast's Torque encounters are manifestations of executions performed on prisoners, from lethal injections to hanging to electrocution and firing squad. This not only echoes the horrors that have plagued the island's history for so many decades, but also the fear Torque and other prisoners face as they step closer and closer to their execution date. The monsters in The Suffering are intelligent as well, often relying on the element of surprise to get the drop on their unsuspecting prey, or scurrying along the ceiling as they pounce whenever you let your guard down. As Torque, the player never quite knows when it's safe to holster their gun, thus it's best to always keep a finger securely on the trigger. Fortunately, your heart will race just as hard once the bullets start flying. The Suffering is an action game above all, taking notes from adrenaline-fueled games such as Max Payne. The Suffering rarely has a dull moment. Just when the player is comfortable with taking on a new foe, the game throws half a dozen at you at once, and when that becomes second nature, a new creature joins the mix. Being a prisoner, Torque must rely on whatever weapons he can find if he wants to survive his journey through hell. The classic Shiv makes do in a pinch, making combat close and personal. Shotguns are incredible for turning your foes into chunks of tendered meat, and dual-wielding pistols will perhaps be your go-to in most situations, as ammunition is aplenty, and it's just so much fun to add a dose of John Woo to the pulse-pounding horror genre. For the most extreme situations where Torque is dangerously outnumbered by these tortured souls, he may tap into his inner rage and become a being that rivals them in brutality. The creature, as it's called, towers over most foes and has a rusted blade for one of its hands. With the press of a button, this monstrous form can clear mobs of enemies with unsettling ease, but one must be careful, because if you remain in this form for too long, it will spell certain death for our hero. Although the creature is integral to the game's overall storyline, it's unfortunate that it isn't explored even more. I had hoped for some kind of frightening revelation by the game's conclusion, yet I was left unfulfilled. That's how I generally felt about most of The Suffering's plot. There are a lot of incredible ideas that feel to build up to something momentous that just isn't there. The best part of the story is undoubtedly the setting. Abbott State makes for a fascinating locale, and it's a thrill to explore its dark, bloody corridors and uncover the multitude of horrific events that have cemented the prison and Carnate Island itself as one of the most damned places on Earth. The site is home to countless murders, executions, unspeakable war crimes, dreadful human experimentations, a shameful history in America's slave trade, and more twisted evils. Torque will learn of these past incidents by finding lost manuscripts, exploring locations that have long since been forgotten, and even witnessing visions of the prison's haunted past. The most sinister characters on The Suffering are ghosts of past residents of the prison. Dr. Killjoy, the psychiatrist, Horace, the electrified inmate, and Hermes, the executioner. These wicked ghosts are complicated individuals, oftentimes aiding Torque as he carves out his escape, while at other times hindering his progress. Their complicated relationship with the protagonist complements their eventual boss battles too, providing a layer of context and drama when it's time to do combat. Torque is undoubtedly one of the most tortured heroes in video game history, yet I wouldn't say he's a great protagonist. Tortured leading characters can make for excellent heroes, just see Silent Hill 2's James Sunderland, but the developers never delve enough into Torque's psyche for me to ever feel a connection with him. Being a mostly silent protagonist doesn't help in a game like this, as I don't think many players want to use Torque as an avatar for them, but to experience his story. The game employs a basic morality system in an attempt to flesh out his character, however I think it does very little to really enhance the plot. Supporting your fellow inmates, protecting the lives of guards, and doing other good deeds will have Torque witnessing visions of his late wife, whose ghostly words seem to hint at him being an innocent man. Giving in to your criminal desires and saving yourself at the expense of others, however, will cause terrifying images of crime scenes, dead bodies, and vicious monsters to pop up on the screen. While this is an interesting concept for the mid-2000s, there's little more of this system than achieving a slightly different ending based on your final karmic score. An impressive feature of the Suffering is the ability to switch between a third-person and first-person perspective. The Suffering arrived before Resident Evil 4 revolutionized how the third-person shooter genre controlled and was presented, and taking that into consideration, it does a fine job. Its closest comparisons would probably be 2002's Blood Rain or the Siphon Filter franchise on PlayStation 1, both of which are excellent titles to model after. Many developers were beginning to embrace the immersive first-person perspective for horror games at around this time, with the Suffering coming just before such classics as Condemned Criminal Origins, Doom 3, and Fear, but after the title System Shock 2 and Half-Life 2. The Suffering is a competent first-person shooter, letting players get up close and personal to all the bloody mayhem Torque engages in. The first-person view also makes navigating many of Abbott Penitentiary's tighter areas much easier. For this game, I mostly stayed with the third-person view, but that was only a matter of preference. Gamers can fully complete the game in either mode, or change perspective at the press of a button. Sound design is one area in which the Suffering triumphs. Abbott State's hallways echo with all manner of horrific sounds, from the screams of dying inmates to the click-clack of the knife-like limbs of monsters tapping on the concrete floors. The voice work is also top-notch, with actors delivering great performances to bring these troubled individuals to life. It's unfortunate that Torque himself doesn't speak, because if it was anywhere close to the rest of the cast, I think it would have elevated him to one of horror gaming's all-time greats. Composer Eric Aho creates a haunting, industrial, and atmospheric soundtrack that amplifies the game's chilling tone and immerses you in its world in ways few other games can. Aho explained that most of the music was created using objects found within that environment, such as hitting and bowing metal rods in the jail cells, slamming dumpsters against walls, or scraping metal in hallways, or striking rocks in the caves. It sounds both natural and otherworldly, just like the game itself. The Suffering was a big seller for Midway right when the publisher needed it. According to lead designer Richard Rouse III, The Suffering was very likely the best-selling action-adventure title Midway had released up to that point. Development on a sequel thus began almost immediately. Midway had demanded new games on its major franchises annually, something that, unfortunately, would be a shot in the leg for all developers under its umbrella. Because of this, the game's sequel, The Ties That Bind, had a suffocating deadline, which limited the direction the developers could take the game in. Thus, Surreal Software chose to reuse most assets from the original game and didn't have the opportunity to address any of the issues that were present in The Suffering. The sequel begins with a flashback to 5 years ago when Torque was serving time at Eastern Baltimore Correctional. Torque believes that his current incarceration is all the fault of a mysterious criminal kingpin by the name of Blackmore, and that Blackmore may also be behind Torque's wife, Carmen, sending him divorce papers earlier in the day. Coincidentally, Torque learns through his friend Miles that Blackmore has just arrived in the prison, and as they talk, Blackmore and his gang confront the duo. Blackmore commands his thugs to beat Miles and Torque, but during their brawl a riot starts elsewhere in the prison. As Torque attempts to make it to safety, he witnesses visions of the monsters that would later haunt him on Carnate Island. Torque then awakens from his dream sequence, and we as the audience question the memory's validity, if any at all. The rest of the game follows Torque just after the events of the first game, as he's escaped Carnate Island and made it back to mainland Baltimore. Instead of finding freedom, however, Torque is apprehended by an army of mercenaries called the Foundation, who refer to Torque as the Prime. Torque meets with the leader of the Foundation, a woman named Jordan, who says her life's work is researching the Malefactors, the name she uses to call the monsters that were encountered on Carnate. Just as she's about to take Torque away, the Malefactors make their attack. Torque escapes the mercenaries' grasp and heads into the city alone. In his quest to locate Blackmore and exact revenge on the man he blames for ruining his life, Torque must not only survive against the hellish malefactors, but also defeat the Foundation, who will stop at nothing to take him in. Where the Suffering told a much simpler story of a tortured man attempting to break free from his shackles, The Ties That Bind weaves a much more convoluted tale, and is worse for it. The story includes many more characters, much higher stakes, much more jargon, and many more villains that it comes out as a bit of a mess. It's difficult to stay engrossed in the story, and frequently I found myself spacing out on the why, and only focusing on killing everything the game put before me, and moving on. If the goal was to make the player feel even closer to the verge of insanity, then it worked superbly because frankly half the time I didn't know what the hell was going on. A messy plot aside, The Ties That Bind nails most other aspects of the horror game experience. The atmosphere here is still top-notch. The city of Baltimore is presented as a dark, seedy world filled with crime, drug addicts, and an untold number of destitute peoples. The streets are piled with garbage, junked vehicles, and trash cans hot with burning flames. The indoor locations are even worse, with an unsettling amount of grime layered throughout each condemned apartment building or dilapidated home. That feeling that you're lost, defenseless in the dangerous inner city is unshakable, and all this is before you consider the flesh-eating monsters, the buckets of blood coating every surface, and the horrifying sights of gore and death found around every turn. The monsters the series is best known for remain frightening, although too many are just ever so slight modifications of creatures found in the first title. In The Suffering, most of the enemies were designed around prison execution, such as being electrified or facing the firing squad. In The Ties That Bind, monsters seem to represent inner city crime. This could have worked out really well, having the creatures characterize the dull horrors of Torque's life, yet the monsters aren't original. Case in point, the mainliner enemy in The Suffering symbolizes lethal injection, and they fling harmful needles at you from afar, with the aim of slowly draining your health. In The Ties That Bind, the same enemy makes a return, but now they represent shooting up heroin. Both creatures look nearly identical, possess the same behavior, and perform the same attacks. It's disappointing that more time wasn't allocated in creating brand new terrors to face, because the monster design is perhaps the franchise's strongest feature. It's not terrible in The Ties That Bind, but it's hard to not feel robbed of the incredible potential. The Ties That Bind is also severely short on boss encounters, with players really only facing off against some bigger bads towards the very end of the game. There are at least some new major villains, most of these being ghosts that conjure up Baltimore's complicated and bloody history. Copperfield is the spirit of a slave hunter who frequently appears to taunt Torque. He boasts of always being able to track down runaway slaves and finds it thrilling when they put up a fight, so he has an excuse to kill them. Copperfield often sicks his hounds on Torque, which are disfigured abominations with the body of a vicious pit bull and the head of a tormented human being. Copperfield, of course, represents Baltimore's and America's racist past, which still haunts the present day and the foreseeable future. Copperfield and the racist energy he brings is something that Torque cannot escape, as it constantly rears its ugly head to bring him back down. The Creeper is another frightening spirit and one of the most grotesque monsters I've ever witnessed in horror. period. He is the ghost of a cruel pimp that first began preying on women of the night before eventually lashing out at women in general, claiming the lives of up to 200 women before he was finally brought to justice. Though he was found guilty and was executed, he became the basis of a terrible urban legend that, to this day, has Baltimore's women gripped in fear. He appears as a sleazy, large, balding man wearing a heavy trench coat and gloves, and his face painted like that of a doll. He takes delight in recounting his murders to Torque, recounting them in vicious detail, and attempts to get Torque to admit that he too found joy in murdering his own wife. When threatened, however, his voice turns sinister, and he opens up his trench coat to reveal that it is actually a part of him. Its insides bloody, and his torso a mesh of organs and gore. Hiding underneath his coat are 3 mostly nude women, impaled from their backsides with a long bladed tentacle that's coming out of their mouths, which he uses to lash out and penetrate his victims in a gruesome, deeply personal manner. The Ties That Bind also relies heavily on pitting Torque against human enemies, much to its detriment. Gunning down waves of soldiers in tactical gear just isn't as interesting as battling against the hideous malefactors. A couple of encounters against the mercenaries would be fine, but you'll be going up against them almost as much as the monsters. It doesn't help that the enemy AI isn't nearly as polished as the malefactors either, as these human foes can easily be funneled into doorways for easy dispatch, and often hang out in the open rather than taking cover. To add salt to the wound, their bullets seem to hit much harder than the rusted blades of the monsters, and their guns will tear through Torque as if he's made out of wet tissue. All of this combines to make battles against the mercs a truly frustrating affair that lacks fun or thrills. Another drawback to the action is that Torque now is limited in the weapons that he can keep. Instead of having access to your entire arsenal, players can only wield 2 primary weapons at a time, not counting your throwable weapons like grenades, molotovs, and flashbangs. This is much more akin to Halo than Doom, and requires a good deal of strategy as to what gear players will want to arm themselves with. This could have worked out well, but too many of the weapons are only good for very specific situations. Rocket and grenade launchers, for instance, are undeniably powerful. They are mostly found in tight, indoor areas where their usefulness is extremely limited. To get the most benefit from them, players almost need to lug them around for long periods just to use them in the one spot where they'll be optimal. For this reason, I ignored them almost completely. Most all other areas of the Ties That Bind are on equal footing with its predecessor. The music by Eric Aho continues to send chills down your spine while exploring and making your blood boil during combat. The morality system returns, behaving almost identically to the first game, and provides an excuse to replay the game for different choices, if nothing else. The ability to change between third and first-person views is also a highlight. Unlike the original, I used the first-person perspective much more because of the frequent firefights against human enemies, and due to levels feeling better suited in this view. Voice acting remains strong, if somewhat improved, thanks to notable voice talents of Oscar nominee Michael Clark Duncan as Blackmore and 6 Feet Under's Rachel Griffiths as mercenary leader Jordan. Overall story may be all over the place, but at least the cast does an excellent job at making the characters matter. Ultimately, The Ties That Bind remains an enjoyable game, though it's far too similar to its predecessor. While the action is still intense and the gore still frightening, it lacks that certain unique touch that the Suffering had. The Ties That Bind doesn't address any of the faults of the first game, and the few changes it does make to the Suffering's formula aren't necessarily for the better. I would still recommend it for fans of action-centered horror games, but I don't think it's a must-play for horror aficionados like the Suffering is. I'd love to see the series make a modern-day return. The horror genre is having a renaissance of sorts, with so many great remakes coming out yearly such as Dead Space, Resident Evil 4, and Silent Hill 2. The Suffering deserves this treatment too. Honestly, I'd love to see a black writer and/or director helm this series. Both titles confront the horrors of racism and the subjugation of black culture in ways few other games have. Indeed, even 20 years later, it's still hard to name memorable black protagonists in video games. In Hollywood, some of the best horror films of the past decade have come from the black experience, and I think The Suffering would greatly benefit in reshaping its story by channeling more of the same energy that made films such as Get Out, The Sinners, Us, and His House such masterpieces. With a black writer and director, I think the themes touched upon in The Suffering, primarily America's dark, racist past, present, and future, could be told in a more genuine, raw way. As it stands though, horror fans everywhere should give The Suffering a go, as it's close to being a legitimate classic. Its sequel, The Ties That Bind, may not completely satiate players' hunger for more, but it's still a tasty cherry on top of a blood-soaked sundae.